Thanks, Mike, and welcome everybody to the Thursday, November 30th, 2017 session in our series on the rise of commercial space businesses in Asia. This series is produced by the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center at Stanford, and we're industry funded by member companies. We're very happy to talk to anybody about membership who is interested. We are getting down to the next to the last session in our series. Our last session will be next Thursday at this same time. And I'm very happy that before we get to the last session in the series, we can have a presentation on a topic that I think is very important and too often overlooked. We have Mr. Chris Blackerby, who is the Chief Operating Officer for a startup company called Astroscale. And Astroscale is tackling the problem of monitoring and measuring and ultimately removing space debris, which is, as we'll see, is an increasing danger for anything up in orbit. Before joining Astroscale, Chris was the NASA attaché in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, responsible for all Asia, and that meant that he was doing liaison between the government space programs, between NASA and the Asian government space programs. It also meant that he was resolving disputes and doing outreach, looking for new kind of opportunities for cooperation. So in addition to Astroscale, at the end of the session, we can also talk a little bit about general regional cooperation. He's been with NASA for 15 years, joined in 2003 as a Presidential Management Fellow, and during his NASA career he's had several positions, including being the Executive Director of the NASA Advisory Council, which is the group of, serious, wise people who are giving advice to top government officials about space-related policy. So I'm really delighted that Chris can join us this morning in Japan from Tokyo. Chris, why don't I just turn the microphone over to you and ask you to give us some prepared remarks, and then we'll go into Q&A that I'll moderate. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks a lot, Richard. Thank you. And you can hear me okay, I assume?
Yep, it's great.
Great, excellent. Well, thanks for that really kind introduction, Richard, and hello, everyone. Nice to see you this afternoon in California. It's 9:30 here in Tokyo. I was hoping to be there in person with you, and that was the plan when I first arranged this with Richard and Brianna, that I would be there to talk to everybody in person. But after I made the arrangements, the launch of our first satellite was scheduled for 2 days ago, for November 28th. So not knowing if it would get delayed, I would kind of balance as to whether I could come out or not, but in the end, I decided I should stick it out here. The launch went up as planned, but it did not continue as planned. I don't know if you've read the news, but there was a failure of the Russian Soyuz launch vehicle. We still don't know why, but the rocket, the bus, and all of the payloads on it, which included 19 different payloads, a big Russian weather satellite and a bunch of smaller satellites, have been lost. So we don't know where and what happened, and there's been no official announcement. But regrettably, it was a tough week here. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that's the reason that I couldn't be there today. So I apologize for not being there in person, and thank you for accommodating me on the online. So I'll get started right here, and let me share my screen. So as Richard mentioned, I was out here with the U.S. Embassy for 5 years as a NASA attaché, and then this summer I was looking for a new challenge and wanted to stay in Japan, and knew the person who was the CEO of this company, Astroscale, and so decided to stay. And so Astroscale is a company that focuses on, as Richard mentioned, monitoring and removing debris from space. So on this initial slide, you can see various views of what it looks like right now in space. All of the dots, of course, are objects in space, both debris and satellites, but most of the things you see are just debris. It's just trash, whether it's discarded satellites or rocket bodies or chips of paint. That's what they all are. And you see a couple of different bands. If you look at the left and the right slide especially, you can see a big cluster right around the Earth, and then a bunch around in a circle, kind of a halo, like looks like almost Saturn's rings around the outside. Those are two different orbits, one low Earth orbit and one geostationary orbit, where the bulk of the satellites are sent. So that's where we send in the low Earth orbit. They send lots of Earth observation satellites and some communications, and then in geostationary orbit, which is out there around that ring, it's satellites that stay over one specific place on the globe, and so you can get a view of one place 24 hours a day. So those are the two main bands, and those are the two main bands that we're most concerned about in terms of debris. So what I'll do is I'll talk a bit about the debris problem first, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we're proposing to do about it, and then we'll take questions. I'll try not to talk too long and leave an ample amount of time for conversation. So let's see, there we go. So first, I opened this presentation with kind of a basic comment, which I hope it's not too elementary for some of you, but it's nice to be reminded that we rely on Earth orbiting satellites for basically everything. Communications, emergency and disaster management, economy and finance, health and environment, security, weather. Basically, if you removed all of the satellite capability that we rely on a daily basis, I think we'd be lost, and especially the generation younger than us would be lost, who never knew what it was like to grow up without this capability. It's something that we take for granted. We wake up every day and check our emails or check the weather or find how to get to a meeting using Google Maps, but none of that would be possible without satellite capability supporting it. So it's not something we think about, but we should be aware that the orbital environment is becoming as important to us to manage and take care of as the terrestrial environment. So really what this issue is an environmental problem. Same way we don't want to pollute the air or the water or on the Earth, we've got to be careful to not pollute the orbital environment as well. It's vital to our current existence. And the problem of orbital debris is becoming worse and worse. And these are just a few recent articles outlining how bad it is. Really, the problem of space debris and what could happen if there's accidents it's not a question of if an accident will happen at some point, it's a question of when. The issue of more and more trash in space could lead to an orbit that's unsustainable. And there's something that was dubbed by a NASA engineer close to 40 years ago called the Kessler syndrome. And this NASA engineer Kessler said, as accidents happen in space, the problem becomes exponentially worse. Two satellites collide, creates a bunch of space debris, and that's that many more opportunities for another accident to happen. And as that goes, it becomes exponential, and then before too long, that whole orbital environment that we rely on daily becomes unusable and can't be supported. So it's a serious problem that people are worried about. They've been worried about from an academic perspective for a long time, but space is big. And so people don't have the immediate impetus to say we need to solve this, because the immediate problem doesn't, the likelihood of a disastrous impact that would trigger a Kessler syndrome type event is still pretty low probability. So as businesses and governments weigh the cost benefit of investing in doing something about it, they end up saying, well, at this point in time, it's not bad enough to address. Of course, we know that's a dangerous problem, because then it becomes too late. It's not addressed until it's too late. And again, a similar analogy is to terrestrial environmental issues. If we don't as we're realizing now with global warming and the like, that if we don't address it on an early stage, then it becomes too late to manage in the long term. It's a commons problem. It's an orbital commons problem. So for those who study international relations and the tragedy of the commons, there's no one governmental entity that is overseeing the orbital environment, and so no one's going to do anything about it. So the problem is getting worse. Here's a video I think you can see, and so the video is striking. You see the red and the white dots. The white dots are active satellites being used. The red dots are debris. 99% of the objects that are in orbit are useless. They are debris. Useless is actually too kind. They're potentially harmful. And so you see there's about 20,000 or so objects, 10 centimeters or more, about the size of a baseball, 750,000 1 centimeter, and 100 million that are under 1 centimeter. Obviously, the bigger objects, the ones larger than a baseball, could cause a catastrophic incident to either a orbiting Earth observation satellite or to potentially a human space. I want to show that video again so you can see, or to something like the International Space Station. And it's something that's going to continue to get worse as we start going to tourism in space or using the orbital environment more. We've got to be more and more wary of the concerns. So this is always a striking slide to me to see how much is up there that is not being used and could be harmful to what we need. What's up there? Sorry, there's a few Japanese in this slide from our company, but you can see that there's both on I guess the left side of the slide, you see the different satellites. So those are unmanned satellites and satellite parts, ones that have gone defunct and are just orbiting and slowly coming back into the atmosphere where they'll eventually burn up. And then there's human-related use of orbit. Space Station was the space shuttle, and we're going to be launching human vehicles again soon from the U.S. And from Russia, of course, is happening, from China. So in that orbit from around 600 to 1,000 kilometers, which is low Earth orbit, a little bit higher, can go to low Earth orbit, it is an extremely crowded environment. And that's the orbit that we're, as a company, are going to be focusing on first. So this is also a striking slide. You can see it starts from the beginning in 1957. So before Sputnik was launched, there was no human-made space debris in orbit, of course, obviously. After that, you can see a steady rise. And if we just look at the black line, or the total objects, that includes satellites in use and trash, you can see that it goes up sharply over time. And there's two big jumps that are clear, and one was in 2007 when the Chinese carried out an anti-satellite test, shooting down one of their old satellites in orbit, creating thousands of pieces of additional debris. Then in 2009, a defunct Russian satellite called Cosmos collided with a telecommunications satellite called Iridium, and that created additional thousands of pieces of debris. So these kind of accidents, whether intentional or not, are going to continue to happen over time. And so if we just left it like this and didn't launch any more satellites, there would still be, going forward, if we didn't launch any more satellites from now until the next 30 years, it would still be an issue, because all of the trash, all of the debris, all the satellites that are up there are still going around in orbit, and they're coming down slowly to the point that the threat is always there. But what's going to be happening in the next few years is a sea change in the way that we're using the orbital environment because of reduced launch costs and increased capability to build satellites that are useful. So you're going to see that in the next 5 to 10 years, we expect thousands of satellites to be launched. Since the start of the space age, there's been about 7,000 to 8,000 satellites launched. We expect in the next 5 to 10 years, there could be between 10 to 15,000 in two different orbital areas. So one in the low Earth orbit between 400 to 800 kilometers. On the right side, it says commercial remote sensing. Those are a lot of Earth observation satellites that we expect to be launched. They're usually smaller. They come down quicker because they're lower orbit, but we expect there's a lot of companies right now, several out in the area where you are, that are focused on this as a business. And then a little bit higher up, between 1,000 and 1,400 kilometers, there's a commercial telecom band. And so there's a lot of companies, the most notable of which are OneWeb, SpaceX, Boeing, who are proposing to launch constellations of satellites in the hundreds to thousands that will be providing, in a lot of cases, global broadband communication. So you could be in an urban canyon in Tokyo or in the middle of a desert, and you would be able to have connectivity. That's what these companies are proposing. There haven't been any launches yet, but we're expecting that at least company OneWeb will probably be launching in the next year. They talk about saying that. And we think that even if only 2 of these companies, all of these are just plans right now, but even if only a couple of them launch, you're talking about an additional 2,000 to 5,000 satellites just in that orbital band of 1,000 to 1,400 kilometers. So that debris problem that was in the previous slide, if it stayed status quo, that there was no other launches, it would still be bad. But we're actually going to be adding a lot more satellites up there. Useful satellites, obviously, but opportunities for collision nonetheless. So in terms of solving the space debris issue, it's a tricky one. The business case is hard to articulate because governments aren't willing to shell out a lot of money for it, and businesses at this point, they're not either. They're saying it's just not worth it right now. So we're trying to focus on 2 different ways to address the problem. And the first is what's called end-of-life services. Sorry, can you still see my screen, or did that? Oh, sorry about that, everybody. Okay, so one is end-of-life services, and that, basically that's saying don't add any more new debris to the orbital environment. So of course these companies are going to launch, they're going to be using satellites that are going to benefit us, but let's prepare any of them to be removed from orbit in case of failure. All of these constellation satellites that I mentioned in the previous slide, they all have a planned end-of-life deorbit plan. They carry additional fuel, for example, and so that when their 3 to 5 year nominal lifespan is up, they just angle down closer to the Earth and go into a much lower environment. They burn up, within weeks or months. That's great that they have that, but anomalies happen. In-orbit anomalies do happen. So the band at the commercial, the communications band, about 1,000 kilometers, it's a high radiation environment. And so because of that, sometimes that induces failure. Sometimes there's human error. We expect that 5 to 10% of the satellites will fail during the course of their life before the end of their planned life. So what we're saying is you need a backup deorbit plan. For these many satellites, there's a backup deorbit plan is needed. So our proposal then is going to be to work with these mega constellations, they're called, these companies that are providing all of this communication or planning to provide these communication satellites, work with them to prepare their satellites with a lightweight plate on each one. So if you're launching 1,000 satellites with company X, each satellite puts a lightweight plate on there, and then it has potential with a magnet on the outside, nickel plate, and when the satellite goes defunct, we would send up a chaser satellite to grab it and bring it back down to remove it from orbit. So that's the plan that we're proposing, and I'll talk a little bit about our technology demonstration for that idea in a little bit. But that's the plan that we're proposing to these mega constellations to say, one, you've got to be a responsible player in space. You can't just leave trash up there. And 2, from a business case, the more satellites you launch, the more risk you're adding to your business, the more potential that there will be for a loss of service to your customers if there's an accident. So we're focused first on end-of-life service. That is, don't add any more new debris. Let's cap what the issue is right now at the level it is first. Next one we would focus on is active debris removal. And that one's tougher. It's tougher from a technology perspective. It's tougher from a business case perspective. It's tougher from a regulatory perspective. From a technology perspective, that end-of-life service, as I said, we would be planning to prepare the satellite before it goes up to be collected at a later time. So we would know where we're going for. We put optical markers on that nickel plate so we could go find it, attach to it, bring it down. We're working in tandem. There would be a semi-cooperative situation. With active debris removal, it's obviously non-cooperative. None of the trash that's up there now was prepared for us to go get it. So we need to think of a technological solution to bring it down. Now, whether that's a net or a harpoon or a magnet or a adhesive, a glue, that's being researched right now. So from a technological perspective, it's hard. From a business case, it's hard. The end-of-life service, the companies, there's a business case, that they don't want to impact their orbital lane, and they want to remove any threats to that they put up there. So bring that back down, be a responsible player. For the active debris removal, if I didn't put it up there, why am I going to be paying to bring it down? Now, the same situation that it's still a potential threat to my business, but it's a little bit tougher to justify, to convince people that they should go up there and remove trash that they weren't responsible for in the first place, because it's costly, of course. And then from a regulatory environment, it's tough. If I put up a satellite, then I can give you permission to come take it down. It's my satellite. But if I didn't, then if there's a Russian satellite up there, a European satellite, what right do we as a Japanese, Singaporean company have to go up there and take down their old trash? And then there's other issues of security. If we create a technical solution to take down a defunct satellite, then that solution could, of course, theoretically be used to take down an active satellite. And then you're getting into areas of security and sovereignty. So the ADR is a challenging issue to resolve. But we want to focus on that as well, because we're a company that wants to try to help sustain an orbital environment that's useful for generations. So for our company, then, I talked a little bit about it, but just to talk a little bit about our company now, from shifting from the problem at hand. We were started in 2013 in Singapore by a Japanese citizen. He was an IT guy, a consultant. He didn't have a space background, but he was always excited and interested in space. And so he hit something of a midlife crisis, as he likes to say, and he wanted to try something different. And he had been hearing a lot about the space debris issue, and so in May of 2013, he incorporated his company, Astroscale, in Singapore. A couple years later, in February of 2015, we opened an office in Tokyo, which is where I'm based right now. And then earlier this year, we opened one in the UK, outside of London, in a place called Harwell. So the Singapore office has only a couple people, the CEO and a few executive assistant-type staff. Here in Tokyo, there's about 25 to 30 now. We're growing at a pretty quick clip. And this is where we do all the R&D. This is where we're designing the satellites. This is where we're building the satellites. We have a clean room and a manufacturing capability in our office in downtown Tokyo. And this is where we're developing the capabilities to monitor and remove debris. We opened the office in the UK for a couple of reasons. It makes sense to be on the other side of the world when we're doing tracking, and when we're doing work, we can have full-time communications with people in the company when we have satellites in orbit, and then just doing the work. It's nice to have a nearly 24-hour operation. We're also building a ground control segment out there, so we'll be able to track the satellites that we launch from our office in the UK. And we're also working there on business development with Europe, and on mission licensing with the UK. The UK is trying to refine some of its space policy right now and make it more attractive to get mission licensing. So every time you launch a rocket, a sovereign nation has to say, yes, we support this satellite, and we're going through the UK to get that support. They've added some incentives, primarily in terms of insurance. They've capped the liability for insurance for satellites, so it makes it a little more attractive to set up shop there. So there's a lot of small satellite companies. In that one slide where I showed all the plans for the many satellites that are going to be launching in the next 5 years, a lot of those companies are working out of the UK as the UK tries to develop this commercial space friendly environment there. In the 4.5 years of existence, we've gone through 3 rounds of funding and secured $53 million US. And with that, we have designed and built our first satellite, which I'll talk about briefly, and I'll mention again in a second, IDEA OSG-1. And then we're in the process of designing and building our second satellite called ELSA-D, which will be our technology demonstration mission. So as a timeline, I talked about it a bit, but 3 different series rounds of funding so far. The first was just to build awareness and prototyping some designs. The second round, we built the IDEA OSG satellite, environmental monitoring, with a Series C, we're focused on completion of the technology demonstration mission, and then moving toward larger production, mass production. So ideally, if we looked a few years in the future, we would like to be seeing the plate that we designed to do end-of-life services on all of these mega constellations, and then be providing service to these spacecraft operators to bring down their defunct satellites, and also be working probably primarily with governments on the active debris removal. So looking for ways to assist to bring down some of these large rocket bodies that are in orbit, or figure out a way to bring down some of the smaller stuff that's already up there, the trash that's already in orbit. So this is our business plan or general company timeline going forward. So the first mission, and it's still a little bit sad for me to look at this slide because it was only 2 days ago that we watched, and I'll show you this, I'll go back. This was the launch from Vostochny Cosmodrome in the eastern part of Russia. It's a new launch site in Russia, and this was only the second time they launched from there. But after a beautiful launch, it went up with no problems. But then when it came time to get the first read from the satellite as it passed over the antenna that we've contracted with, we didn't get any information. And so we weren't sure what was happening. But then we soon found out that none of the other payloads that were on the mission were able to connect to their satellites either. So we knew it wasn't a problem with our mission, or we had a good feeling it wasn't. And then that was confirmed later when it was announced that the mission failed. And again, Russia still hasn't announced the cause or exactly what happened even. So there's nothing much we can say other than we've lost track with it, and it seems like no other payloads have survived. But again, I can't say too much about it because we don't know anything, and really it's up to the Russian space agencies to make that final call. And so we're really just still in the process of waiting to hear about what happens. There's a commission that's been assembled in Moscow to investigate what happened and why and where, if anywhere, it is right now. But the intention of this mission, it was a small payload, 22 kilograms, and it had what you see, the space debris monitor, the sensor. And on the sensor, there were lines, conductive electrical lines, about 3,000 conductive electrical lines on that yellow panel that you see there. And this was going to fly around in an orbit where we don't really know everything about what's up there. It was going to give us a better understanding of micro debris, sub-millimeter sized debris in orbit. And so every time a little piece of this sub-millimeter debris would hit this panel, it would trigger, it would cut one of these electrical lines, and it would be able to tell us how big, where it was in orbit. So we'd then be able to extrapolate from that and figure out a better understanding of the orbital environment. We had the scientific community was very excited about this to get a better understanding of the environment of sub-millimeter sized debris, and then satellite operators could have benefited just from having a clearer map of what to look out for. So it's unfortunate that it's where it is now, and we're currently in the process as a company of figuring out how to go forward on this side. This was a monitoring mission, though, so this was not our primary business case. So the loss of this is quite unfortunate, but it's not going to impact our longer-term business model of removing the debris, as talked earlier. The end-of-life services and the active debris removal will go on regardless. This would have been excellent data to provide, but it's not going to impact our long-term business case. We learned a lot from the mission. I mean, it was our first attempt to build a satellite. We were confident it was going to work well, and so we learned a lot that we're hoping to transfer over to our next missions. So again, there's a launch a couple days ago. Our technology demonstration satellite is called ELSA-D, End of Life Services Demonstration Satellite. In this one, we're launching two satellites together. They're going to be connected. And it's going to be a bit bigger, of course, about 150 kilograms total. The chaser satellite, the one that you see with the little wings off to the side, that's the main satellite that will have all of the capability, the capturing system, and the package that would be able to connect to the other satellite. The other one is basically a box. It's a dummy satellite that's simulating space debris. So we're going to launch them up together in 2019 timeframe. And so the basic plan of what we're going to do, we're going to launch them together up to about 550 kilometers orbit. And the first thing we're going to do is separate them. And we're going to try to separate them so the target satellite, the debris stand-in, stays stable. So we're going to separate it once so it stays stable, and then we're going to approach it using that magnet. So you can see on here, on the satellite that has the wings on it, the chaser, you see the little circle with our logo on it, the A. That's going to be the magnet. And it's going to come up, and then you can't see it, but on the target satellite, there'll be a plate, and then the A will stick out, attach to it, and bring it back in. That's the first one. We're going to then do it again where we initiate a tumble of the target satellite, of the debris stand-in. We're going to initiate a tumble, and then we're going to have the chaser come up and do relative navigation, so it kind of dances around the target, finds the plate using these optical markers, attaches to it again, stabilizes, keeps going. Then we'll do it one more time from a farther distance, and we're going to come in again, do another tumble, bring in the chaser, again, relative navigation, attached to it, and so the third time we will connect. So demonstrating rendezvous and docking and proximity operations capability is our goal. Once we connect for the third time, we'll drop to an evacuation orbit, lower down in the lower orbit, so then it will evacuate, go into the atmosphere, and burn up within a certain amount of time. Not sure how long that is going to depend on what our orbit is, but we're going to bring it down to degrade into the atmosphere. So that's our concept. Again, we would hope that what we're hoping is we're working together at the same time with these mega constellation companies to attach this plate, that then we would build a bunch of these ELSAs, the little chaser satellites there. The long-term goal is mass production of these chasers that then would work with the mega constellations to bring them down and provide this service as their satellites fail. So overall, our goal is we're really an environmental company in space. You know, that's the way to look at it. It's the same way that there's companies that are here to protect the environment and make sure we have a clean environment here to survive. Well, we're doing the same thing for the orbital environment. And our focus in the near term is to work with these low Earth orbit-based mega constellations, of which there's going to be thousands in the next few years that have the potential to damage the orbital environment. And so if we can put a small plate on each one of those, and then we can build the chasers to go up there and bring them down, we think that will be a service that will benefit their business, and it will show just a responsible use of space. And that's what we're proposing. And so the first semi-cooperative demonstration of this will be launched in about 2 years, and then hoping that we'll be working simultaneously to get customers that we can provide a service business from the 2020s. So that's it. I'll maybe switch back to a full picture screen, Richard, and then that sound okay?
We'll open up the floor to audience questions, but first I want to ask one or two.
Sure.
With regard to the dangers of debris in space, is it really the smaller number of very large objects, or is it all the very small objects? Because you're also talking about different orbits and therefore different speeds, and I'm sure there are just all sorts of various kinds of, strange ellipses. Not everything really looks as orderly as the picture you've got.
Well, and the picture is pretty disorderly, and it's not even that orderly. But yeah, it depends on who you ask. There's different theories as to which would be better. Some analysts, scientists say if you just remove a few of the big pieces, then you just reduce that risk so much that's the big issue. Others say there's so many small pieces out there that could create something really bad. I mean, there's chips of paint that have dented the space station windows. They're going at 8 kilometers a second, 17,500 miles an hour. And so that's a bullet, right? And so that chip of paint could do significant damage. So I think a lot of people say you bring down the big objects and you're really going to reduce the potentiality of a disaster significantly compared to those smaller ones. But it depends on who you ask. Both sides have a valid argument. And you're right. There's satellites up there. There's one European one called EnvySat, and it's just spinning. It's like the size of a bus, and it's just spinning through an orbit. And bringing that down is something that a lot of governments are talking about wanting to do. But again, the technical capability alone is really difficult to master.
At this point, at least in terms of what's not classified, this Russian rocket and its payload is not really in a place people know exactly where it is, right?
Well, this one, the one that we were on, you mean? Yeah, we don't know where it is. And, you can, all this is public, you can see in the papers that there's rumors that it might have crashed into the ocean. But we have different antenna operators here trying to find where it is, but no one's identified it yet.
So one of the things that impresses me on the business side is that the people who insure satellites or insure launch services should be very interested in working with Astroscale as kind of a way to avoid, maximum damage, future liability. Do you think that you'll see that? Is that how the business looks?
That's what we're hoping to do. We're talking to insurers and saying, write some aspects into your policy that if a company has, on the EOL side, if you have a provision for deorbit if the satellite goes defunct, then we knock down your premium costs a certain level. So we're talking to insurers to try to work with them, but it's a multi-pronged effort that we have from a kind of trying to influence the policy side. So talking to the UN, for example, there's groups in the UN that are focused on space debris. There's interagency groups, all the different space agencies, NASA and JAXA and European Space Agency getting together and talking about solving the problem. We're working with them. Even things like the World Economic Forum, we have representation on to try to increase awareness of the problem and put some kind of, I won't call it regulation because you can't regulate it, as I said. It's not a national territory, but keep convincing people that it's a problem that has to be addressed, and talking to specific governments. So I say the UK was revamping their space policy. We're talking to the Japanese about this as well. Put in conditions that say we will only, support your mission if you have this backup plan. So yes, there's a variety of lanes that we're focused on to try to raise awareness and almost peer pressure in a lot of ways to say this is an issue that has to be solved. Let's work all together through these different insurers, interagency groups, intergovernmental groups, national agencies to make people aware and look for the solution.
Well, really, congratulations on getting this far. To get that much venture capital is an achievement, and it indicates that a lot of people think this is a good direction for investment. So I'd like to open the floor to questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and state your question, and I may relay it, depending on how well you can hear it, Chris. Louise?
Hi. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm really interested in the active and moving part of your business, and more specifically, which reason you have to want to bring the degrees down rather than keeping them in some place. I'm sure it's due to regulatory issues, but in a fiction world, if you could keep that debris, how would you buy it from the company who made it, or would it be free for you to access?
I see. How much of that could you get?
A little bit, but I'm going to ask you to repeat it for me, Richard.
I think that the basis of the question is, okay, if you're removing debris, do you get the rights to the debris after you remove it? And what would you do with it, right? Or are you just going to let it burn up, or is this also something you could do?
That's a great question. There was actually a Japanese manga, the comic books called Planetes, Planetes, I think, and it was about a guy who lived in a space station and went around collecting space debris and then bringing it back and melding it down into usable metal or usable material for something else. Now, that was a comic book, so not really something we're focused on, but the concept is interesting. As for the rights to it, I don't know, frankly. I don't think we would, but that's something we would have to think about or talk to the customer about. Right now, our plan is to just deorbit it and let it burn up in the atmosphere. It seems, ideally it would be great to either, some companies are talking about in-orbit servicing. That's something else we're thinking about, which would be if, for example, there was a problem on a satellite or it ran out of fuel, send up something like our chaser satellite, not just to attach to it and bring it down and deorbit it, but to fix it, to put more fuel in, or to have a robotic arm to fix one of the problems. So that's something that some companies are talking about. No one at this point, I think it's just cost prohibitive, is talking about going up and taking it to a different location, because you couldn't bring it back down, because bringing it back down, it would burn up. Unless you had a capability where you encompassed it and then brought it back down and it had a plate that allowed it to re-enter the environment, the atmosphere, the way that the space shuttle did, or certain satellites that can be returned to Earth.
Or even have it in some sort of a junkyard in space where you could then do something with it in space.
So that's where the cost prohibitive nature of it comes in, because that would mean building something like the space station. Now, those thinking out loud, there could be creative, interesting ideas, something like the space station. If the space station partners decide they want to not use it anymore and it's still up there, could a company say, hey, we'll pay you, we'll keep the space station, and we'll turn that into the junkyard in space, and we'll bring all your satellites, your defunct satellites, to us, and we'll build different stuff up there with the material. So the ideas exist, but right now, building a capability that would allow for that, I think it's not a viable business case at this point. But it's a creative, interesting idea.
Thanks, Chris. Next question. Go ahead.
What's the state of mapping the debris in space, the history of that, and also the perspective of turning it into an entrepreneurial opportunity? If you can map it, you know where it is, you can get the money, you can go do something with it.
So I got that one. Yeah, I got that one. So we map most of it. The U.S. military does, and there are some private companies, different countries all have antenna that look up, and they provide a pretty good map right now. There's a JSPOC, the Joint Space Operations Command, is the U.S. military one, and they provide a very comprehensive map of space. There's a commercial aspect called ComSpoc that also does that. There's different government agencies in different countries that are looking at it, and this is all under the realm of what's called Space Situational Awareness, SSA. All of that basically is done from the ground. So the proposed satellite that we had, IDEA OSG-1, was going to contribute, ideally, to this mapping. We were going to provide a better map of sub-millimeter debris in low Earth orbit. That was our plan. So the mapping a mapping, especially in situ, would be great, and that's what we were planning to do with IDEA, do an in situ mapping of the orbital environment, which there's not much of. Of course, unfortunately, we're not able to do that now. NASA is proposing, or they're planning to launch a mission called Dragon, which they'll put on the space station, which is also going to be doing a similar thing to what we were planning to do with IDEA, monitor small debris in the orbit of the space station. So there's certain agencies, not too many companies, but certain agencies, institutions that are talking about this. As a business case, it's not very sustainable. People, when we went around and said, hey, we're going to have this great debris map of sub-millimeter garbage in space. Hey, NASA, hey, ESA, hey, JAXA, hey, companies, SpaceX, do you want this? They'd say, yeah, we'd love it, but we're not going to pay for it. so the business case for that is not really apparent. But from a scientific perspective, it's great, and people would love to have it. It's just they're not willing to pay for it. So that's kind of where it stands on the mapping. And we get a pretty decent map already. I mean, through JSPOC, through ComSPOC, through other national groups, they can tell us where things are going, and they can provide what's called conjunction analysis. So they can see, based on the orbital dynamics, they can say, hey, satellite A is going to hit satellite B in 12 hours, one of you better move up or down, and then so you work together with the satellites and say, okay, we'll drop ourselves 5 meters and then we'll pass by each other. So there's people that monitor that 24/7, 365 and provide conjunction analysis, but it doesn't always work. As I mentioned earlier, that crash between the company Iridium and the Russian satellite, that happened. So there's human error, there's things that they can't see. So a better map is always more appreciated, but that's not a business case.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
I wonder if you can clarify what you mean by mapping of the sub-millimeter debris, because I think you said earlier in your presentation there are potentially hundreds of millions of pieces on that scale up in orbit. So are you talking about checking out the density at different orbits and altitudes? Because surely you are talking about mapping the trajectories of individual pieces of debris. And also I wonder, with the current detection you have, do the pieces that impact your satellite get absorbed so that they're no longer a problem? Or do you continue to track their future trajectory after they pass through your satellite?
So I think I got all that. The first question, in terms of mapping that debris, the number that I show there, tens of millions of pieces, that's an estimate. We can't track all that sub-millimeter debris from the ground, so all we can do is guess. And so what our IDEA OSG-1 would have done is provide a proof of the theory that's out there. We were expecting it would be hit several times a month. If it got hit more, then we'd say, oh, there's more than we thought. If it got hit less, we might be able to extrapolate that, oh, maybe we're a little off. It's not as many as we thought. So it would have just given us another data point to understand a little bit better something in situ, which is always, it's good to have both, but it's always great to have an in situ reference and a reference from a terrestrial monitoring. So no, we weren't going to be trying to map every piece, but we were going to try to get a better validation of what the theory currently is. I think your second question was referring to when the debris hit the satellite that we had put up there. Is that right? So unfortunately, we'll never know because it's not going to work. But the theory was it would hit it and then it would basically absorb into that satellite. It would break the conductive line. Again, there was 3,000 or more than 3,000 conductive electrical lines on that monitor. It would hit one. They were all very close, microns apart. So we could see how many conductive lines it broke, and that would give us an idea of how big it was and where it was. So it would give us just that better concept. But then it would just be absorbed into that. It would wait in that satellite, and when it was done with its mission, it would re-enter the atmosphere, and everything, our satellite plus the little pieces of debris that hit it, would all burn up in the atmosphere.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Back in the back.
Is there any possibility of setting up a replacement satellite?
So I heard the question. It would be great. We're talking about that right now. I'm the CEO and I are discussing how best to address that needs next. There's a couple options. We were sponsored by a Japanese company, OSG. It's IDEA OSG. It's a precision tool maker, and so they sponsored us. So we're talking with them as well. So our investors, our sponsors, senior management of the company, we're all deciding what to do next. The gentleman's question earlier about the business case makes us a little bit hesitant because we are a company. We do need to make money. So we want to provide this kind of mapping, but we've got to look for the revenue stream as well. But if we find people that are willing to help us work together on it, then we haven't shut the door on it yet. It would be a little bit tough to think that we're going to do one that's solely dedicated to mapping, but maybe we can take that sensor and put it on one of our other satellites and do a dual mission. All that at this point is uncertain. So, short to answer your question in a short way, we don't know, but we'll see. The longer answer is we're thinking about it and assessing the various aspects of support and our next steps of business to see if that's what we'll do.
Okay, great. Next question. I'm curious about your funding. Where did the money come from? Was it Silicon Valley venture capitalists or what, who's involved?
This is all Japanese.
Okay.
And so it's a combination. There's a few companies, ANA Holdings, the airline, they have an investment arm, so they've invested in us. Several venture capitalists have invested. And then a big bulk of it comes from this investment corporation, INCJ. It's a public-private, INCJ, a public-private partnership that is kind of under the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, METI. But then it's kind of a semi-private. So they look for opportunities for Japanese companies to invest in. So they've the total number, I think, the 20 million or so, 25, and then the rest from various venture capitalists and other companies.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Over to you.
Why do you think headquartered in Singapore?
Why headquartered in Singapore?
So partially it's because that's where the founder lives. He was living there, and that's where he started the company. And then there's benefits from a tax perspective, from a business perspective to be there. Richard, as we were talking earlier, I don't remember if I think it was before we started the conversation. There's a lot of companies that are based there, so it's a good environment to be an international company. They make it attractive to base companies there, and our CEO travels constantly, and so being based out of there, he can get to Australia or to Europe or wherever quite easily. So that's kind of why it started. We'll see how we progress and what we do going forward.
Bevan.
Why did the Japanese company wants to invest in this project? Maybe I missed it in the beginning.
Why did your investors want to invest?
Why do they want to invest? So any investor, and we're continuing to look for more investors and supporters, but any investor, I think, looking at this has to look at it from two different perspectives. And this is answering your question, I think. Well, let me answer it this way first. A lot of the Japanese companies, INCJ in particular, INCJ, they're looking to foster innovative, creative, technologically advanced Japanese companies. I mean, it's in their best interest to see Japanese companies succeed, hire more engineers, create this ecosystem of engineering excellence among Japan, and especially with startup companies. As any of you who's had any familiarity with Japan, Richard obviously included, it's not the most entrepreneurial-minded country. Usually people graduate from school and they go into big companies and they stay there for life. So finding a way to foster these innovative venture companies is in the interest of the Japanese government. So that's why this INCJ, one of the reasons why INCJ was looking to help us succeed. Other companies, then to move on from that, the other ventures and other companies that have already invested and that we'd be looking to invest in the future, you're not going to get an immediate ROI. this is immediate in the next 6 months or a year. I mean, you have to have a little bit longer term vision. So we think that this company has a revenue stream capability. We think it has a business case that's going to come to fruition. But you have to have a little bit of patience as an investor. And you also have to have a vision for the greater scheme of what we're trying to do. We're trying to not just have a quick near-term cash out. We're trying to have a positive impact. It sounds too grandiose, but literally on generations. Again, I mentioned I have two daughters, young daughters. I want them when they're my age to be able to have the same benefits that I do. That we can do this. Literally, this is facilitated through satellite communication. So, as an investor, of course, investors want to make money, and we expect to. We plan to. But you also have to have a longer-term vision of doing something that's beneficial to society. And so we look for investors that have those two visions, those goals.
Chris, to the extent that you can tell us, are you receiving revenue from, say, government contracts or grants or other kinds of things other than the investment money right now?
So we're starting to. We're looking at it. And there's right now, it's at the kind of base level, but we're working with the Japanese government on some things. The Japanese government is interested in trying to find a solution for ADR. And that's where the government side is going to, ADR was the active debris removal. That's second of the two streams I talked about. And that's going to be a government-funded activity, most likely. As I mentioned, the business case from a company perspective is not really there, but from a government perspective, trying again to have long-term societal benefits, there is.
Of course, a lot of the customers for that could be governments.
Yeah, they could. And the governments are who put most of that junk up. So, yeah. So it started, Richard. Sorry, yeah, we're starting to work on those grants and other lines of funding outside of that.
Next question. Go ahead, Louise.
Just very quickly you've been speaking about how countries try to develop new policies to attract the companies, especially in terms of insurances. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience with the insurance now that your satellite has disappeared?
Can you say anything about insurance or what happens as a result of your satellite disappearing?
Oh, the one we just did? Yeah. Prefer not to discuss that so much. Yeah. I would say that we have to make as a small company. So.
Yeah, and this is also gets into things where everything is negotiated. So,
Yeah,
back in the back again.
This may sound frivolous, but I'm thinking of a very, very old movie made by Mel Brooks called Spaceballs. Did it have any influence on the company?
I didn't hear the question. I heard the lead up, and I just started thinking about the Schwartz is with us. But
I just wonder if that old movie, Spaceballs, had any influence on the company at all.
Influence on the company. I don't know. I don't think so. It's a great movie. I haven't seen it in a long time, but I remember it. I remember watching it when I was a kid. I don't know if Spaceballs did, but I think another movie in a way did, and that's Gravity. If you've seen the movie Gravity, I don't know if it influenced him to start it, but it certainly created a bit more of a societal awareness of what the problem was. I won't give it away, but I'm not giving anything away to say it's about space debris and how astronauts can survive in what becomes a Kessler syndrome event. The Kessler syndrome I described earlier of just cascading debris exponentially increasing as accidents happen on top of each other. So if you haven't seen the movie, you should check it out. It's Hollywood, so it's a bit dramatized, over-dramatized. But the danger that it portrays is real. And it's a little more realistic than Spaceballs.
Thank you. Go ahead again.
I'm trying to understand where your revenue stream would come from. You mentioned that the ADR is so expensive that it's probably going to be governments that do this. So would your company be developing technologies to sell to these governments to put on these missions, and then they take most of the other costs?
Yep, I got that one, Richard. It's a great question, and it's the question that I frankly, wrestled with when I was thinking of coming over here, and I talked to the CEO about it extensively. It's hard to identify a very clear revenue stream right away. But we think there's two possible ways. Among other, small side benefits, the two main drivers are that end of life. So the revenue stream in the near term is going to come from talking to these large mega constellations and first saying, we'll sell you this plate. You attach this lightweight plate to all your satellites. You are prepared. You are ready to bring that thing down when it goes defunct before the planned end of life. So we sell the plate for a fairly inexpensive price. It's not that expensive to build a nickel plate. But then the cost of service, us going up there, finding it, attaching to it, bringing it down, removing it as a potential danger to your business, removing it as a potential environmental hazard, that's where that cost would be. So our near-term revenue stream is going to be through that. On the ADR side, it's, working with governments, developing that technology, and then, contracting out and saying, once we can develop a technology for ADR that can remove these bus-sized pieces or can remove, 100 pieces of tiny debris using a net or something like that, then we say to the governments, you pay us a certain cost and we'll go up and start cleaning up for you. The same way that a trash company for a local government says, we'll go clean up the trash. You pay us to do it. And so those are the two different larger revenue streams that we're considering.
Have you thought about getting into the insurance business itself, so that if the company buys the plate, they also buy an insurance policy from you, and then on the assumption that more people are going to buy plates and policies than ever have, satellites that go defunct, you have to pay the cost of doing the launch then out of your own operating budget.
Yeah, I mean these are creative ideas that we haven't talked about that, but we're open to thinking about a variety of different options to find the revenue stream, and then also to nudge the regulatory aspect, whether it's the insurance aspect or the intergovernmental regulatory aspect, towards something that's more friendly to what we're doing. So we're actively discussing those kind of things.
Yeah, about 25, or actually more like 30 years ago, the French government started putting a tax on blank cassette tapes with the assumption that people were making recordings of music on those cassette tapes. And they divided it up so that about a quarter of the revenues went to the actual artists in France. And a quarter of the revenues were devoted to something they called the French Music Office, which was promoting French music around everywhere. If you could get a little bit of money off of every GPS set that's sold, you might have plenty of revenue.
But it's a good point, right? You consolidate all of these other regulators, and you say you just pay a little bit extra. You pay a little bit extra on when you get your license or when you do something, and then that that will provide this service then. Thinking of those different schemes of how to arrange it. So it's a fun business to be in, because we're trying to think of those creative schemes to make it a profitable business, while at the same time, our team here, our engineering team, is now laser focused on building the capability and making sure we can do it technically, because we need both, obviously.
Yeah. I saw a question up here. Go ahead.
Hi, Adam Glifton, local technologist. I'm wondering if there's a way of monetizing with China with their anti-sat tests. When they did that, of course, it was way worse than I think they ever expected, and that seems to be one of the biggest risks with the smallest pieces right now. But how can you, of course, first lasso the pieces, but also lasso the cost and the profit of doing that service? Have you looked into that?
We haven't much. I mean, so I think I got the whole question. How do we monetize cleanup of the ASAT test debris? Is that right?
Right.
That's a tough one for a couple reasons. First of all, whose debris is it? Whose right is it to clean it up? And so even if let's say we even had the technology to send up a net to, corral a bunch of the pieces and bring them down, does China have a legitimate beef to say, hey, that's not your job, that's our debris? And whether, and maybe then they would want it cleaned up. But yeah, I'm just thinking out loud right now because frankly we haven't thought about that. And of course it does get a little bit sensitive when dealing with cooperation with China or any kind of work with China. And then monetizing it generally, so you can see by my hesitations that we haven't thought much about this one. I have a hard time finding how we could monetize it. If you have any ideas, send me an email.
If I can ask a follow-up question that's kind of different from the monetization, how does your intellectual property protection work? Is really the fact that you know how to build satellites, the know-how, is that the basis of it, or do you have some patented technologies already?
We have some patents pending that we've applied for some of our magnetized technology and some of the capabilities that we're working on. So that's how we would do it. I guess that's it. So we'll work on that in terms of trying to protect our IP rights, and of course, keeping it the other technical capabilities we're developing, primarily on this rendezvous and docking, close proximity and operations, relative navigation, that whole capability of finding something and dancing with it, moving around with it in the same way so that we can then connect it and stabilize it. That's the technology that we're working on, and we are aware of, concerned with, and addressing the issues of IP rights. Obviously, you need to have that to be it.
Okay, thank you. Saw several. You first, then you.
I wonder if you would translate intergovernmental regulations to the word space law, and if there are any opportunities in space law emerging that could even create, possibilities for your company, and how that might compare to maritime law and that history of all the international bodies of water that are outside individual countries' jurisdictions.
Okay.
Maritime law is just a great analog for what we're doing, and that's exactly what we haven't. So I guess my first short answer is we haven't addressed it fully yet, but that's something that we're looking at as maritime law as the model. And there is space law. I mean, there's space laws out there, but it's all of them again are unenforceable for the most part, but they exist. But you're spot on in using maritime as the analog, and that's exactly what we're looking at. Talking to people who are experts in maritime law and seeing, looking at the history of how that has proceeded to the current regime that exists now to monitor maritime activity in international waters. That's what we need to continue to look at.
Do you see this moving ahead? And if it's moving ahead, what is the kind of main organization that might be driving it? Is it a branch of the UN or?
Yeah, there's this UN COPUOS, Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COP, Uses of Outer Space, UOS, COPUOS. That does a lot. There's something called the IADC, Interagency Debris Committee. Those are space agencies that are working on this. But yeah, those are and then as I think I mentioned, the Global Economic Forum has subgroups that are working on it. So it's a combination of multi-governmental, intergovernmental, and then the national agencies that are working on it. But it's pushing a string, right? I mean, anytime you deal with a government itself, I mean, you, Richard, were in the government, it's slow and bureaucratic, and then you make that a UN type body, even more so. I mean, so it's just trying to push the noodle a little bit, and it takes time. But we're working on it. We're working on it.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
I wonder what's your sense of the ballpark magnitude of the cost of one of these AER missions to a constellation satellite? And does it make any sense to do a reusable chaser satellite or one that does multiple deorbits?
Yeah, I got that one. Cost, it's going to depend on launch costs. It's going to depend on bus integration costs. We're thinking of different schemes of how we can keep it low. I really don't know yet, but you can extrapolate costs roughly several millions, but we just don't know. It's going to depend on a variety of factors. So we're thinking of creative ways to work with these companies to lower the costs, right? So maybe we integrate on the same bus and the same launch vehicle. So let's think hypothetically, Company X just lost 2 satellites in their constellation. They went defunct too early. We get 2 of our chasers. You can pack in a couple different satellites on one launch vehicle. So maybe we can pack in 4. They can pack 4 of 2 of their replacement ones. We pack 2 of our chasers, launch them together, so reducing costs in that sense. We take the 2 chasers, we attach to the pieces of debris and bring those down, and they replace into the orbit. So one of the things we're talking to the companies and also some of the regulatory, the country space agencies about is to institute a one-up, one-down policy. So if you Company X, if you have a failed satellite, you cannot replace it until you bring that one down. And there's no regime that's going to force that onto them, of course, again, this whole commons issue. But as a responsible player in space, you should do it. And there's companies that are saying they're going to do it. One of the most far-reaching companies on thinking about this is OneWeb. And they've come out and said, we want to institute a one-up, one-down policy. The UK Space Agency, which is trying to redo its space policies, has said the same thing. We want to try to cultivate or sensitize a one-up, one-down policy. And so if we can get that kind of policy in place, then we can think about how to work with companies to share costs to make it more reasonable economically to do this.
Chris, we're getting close to the end of our time. I want to kind of ask you to take off your Astroscale hat for a minute. And, you represented NASA in Asia for 5 years. And I'm curious how you see the different Asian economies developing in this regard. When I put together this series, I was really looking around for startup companies, especially all over Asia. And I found a much higher percentage in Japan than I expected to find. And I didn't find anything in South Korea. I did find a little bit in China, but not as much as I expected. And I'm just curious how you see the development of commercial space activities in these different areas.
Space is hard. Space is difficult on so many levels, and it's so tough to cultivate a startup industry around something where failure can be so immediate and common. And speaking, of course, with recent experience, it's risky. It's risky on so many levels. And so doing a start, I say we have $53 million in funding. Sounds like it would be great if we were an IT company in a garage, down the street from you guys. But when your model is launching rockets and building satellites, it's I won't say it's not that much, but it goes quick. So having a startup company, you have to have the luxury of being a developed economy, first of all, that's able to support these kind of industries. And so clearly Japan sets itself apart from its neighbors in that sense. China, yeah, we see a few in China. That's always tough to get a real clear view of what's happening there, obviously, for a variety of reasons. South Korea, we just don't see too many yet at this point. And then beyond that, no other countries really have the economic capability to support that kind of industry. Southeast Asia, they want to become more of a player, and there's countries that are really getting excited about doing it. Vietnam is starting their own space agency. They're building a big space center for building satellites and education just outside of Hanoi, about 30 kilometers. It should be done soon. Philippines just announced that they're starting their own space agency last year. Australia is becoming more of a player, or a different type of model as well. Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, they all have a capability, but that's national space agencies, not on the venture side. And anytime you're getting into space, you basically start at the education capacity building level, maybe then move up to Earth observation, building a satellite for Earth observation, then up to maybe more deeper space science, and then to human space flight. So there's a continuum, and there's not too many countries that have worked on that, and you pretty much have to get through most of those levels before you can start to see a viable venture business. But in Japan, you're right.
That makes good sense, and I appreciate your kind of perspectives and tidbits of information there. For those of us who are physically here, we can go outside and have some coffee and cookies right now and enjoy talking to each other. I hope that you can come by and maybe in February we can meet, and sometime before long I hope to have a real cup of coffee with you, Chris. I appreciate it so much today. If you would, please join me in thanking Chris.
Well, thanks to you all. I, again, really regret that I can't come and join you for that coffee right now, and hopefully I'll be swinging through again, and we can touch base, Richard, and arrange something else in the future.
Okay.
If you have any
That
questions,
sounds great, Chris. We'll sign off for now. Good luck with everything.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.